All right, broadcasting live from the apocalypse, coming to you from our secluded bunker on the west bank of the Halifax River. We call this the Pandemic Palace, the COVID Castle. I am Scott Velasco, and you're joining me for part 2 of our series on the history of audio recording. And when we left off part 1, we had just gotten through Thomas Edison's phonograph in 1877. One of the things I said was that Edison did not envision the phonograph being used for music recording. At least that wasn't a primary objective. Edison, a businessman, right? He sees this thing to boost productivity in the office. But the public, sort of out of his control, is demanding entertainment. They want recordings of music. And there are companies there happy to oblige. And Edison picks up on this thread. In fact, I have a photo here. This is Edison's workshop, which turns into truly the first recording studio. You can see that he's got pianos and organs and drums and implements of destruction, all set up around a number of his phonographs. Well, he's working on this, and there's something else happening. There's something else brewing out there, and that is the tech is now out and available. And we start to get competitors. We start to get other people coming to market with their own audio recording devices. Perhaps most notably, great American Alexander Graham Bell. You know him because he invented the telephone. At least that's kind of what you've always been told. Maybe there's some argument against that idea, but he certainly popularized the tech that went on to become the telephone. And he actually won an award for his work on the telephone, Bell did. He won what was called the Volta Prize, and he took the award money from Volta and set up a laboratory that he called the Volta Lab, that later turns into Bell Laboratories. And the first primary objective, the first thing he's working on in the Volta Lab, he wants to improve the recording of audio. And so he and his staff, they purchase a lot of Edison phonographs and they get to work on them. They're trying to figure out a way to do that thing, but do it better. And it doesn't take long before they succeed, before they are able to not exactly create their own device, but tinker with and modify the Edison phonograph enough to get an improved recording quality out of it. How did they do that? Well, there were a few things they changed, but here's the big one. With Edison's phonograph, you had a stationary needle on the diaphragm, and then the cylinder would move under that needle. As the cylinder spins, it is moving under the needle. The drawback of that is that it's a lot of mass moving. It's a lot of machinery kind of vibrating sympathetically, and it creates a lot of unnecessary noise in the recording. So one of the things that Bell does is he sets a fixed cylinder. It spins, but it stays in place, and the needle and diaphragm move across the cylinder instead of vice versa. And in doing so, he's able to get less unnecessary vibration, which means he's able to get a clearer recording. And Bell, to his credit, approaches Edison and explains, I improved your device. You know your thing? I fixed it. I made it better. And suggests that the two of them go into a partnership on this device. Thomas Edison, riding the wave of success that he pretty much stayed on most of his life, declines this partnership. His company is doing just fine on its own, thank you very much, and he sends Bell on his way. So what does Bell do? Well, Bell says okay. He sets up a manufacturing business and starts producing his own version of the Edison phonograph. He doesn't call it the phonograph. Bell, being a clever man, calls it the Graphophone. He just took the two sides and switched them around and was done with it. He wasn't concerned with branding so much. And he takes his new device, the Graphophone, to market. And it sells very well, actually. In fact, it sells so well that it begins really cutting into the profit margin of the Edison devices. And Thomas Edison, remember, businessman, a little upset by this, a little panicky. He starts to think maybe he made a mistake sending Alexander Graham Bell on his way, but it's a mistake that can easily be remedied by suing him right out of the market. And so begins this kind of elaborate series of lawsuits. You have Edison suing Bell, phonograph versus graphophone, because Edison's saying he stole my thing, he stole my patent, it's patent infringement. But at the same time, it was an improvement on his device. And so the phonographs that Edison is manufacturing at this time, he adopts that improvement. He changes it around, so now he also has the stationary cylinder and the moving needle. And so Alexander Graham Bell has a very reasonable countersuit of, maybe I stole his thing, but he stole my thing too. And these two are suing each other like crazy, and they're going back and forth. And while they're doing all of this, neither one of them can produce new devices, which is going to end up having a really unexpected consequence. Friends, I am a fan of the law of unexpected consequences, and this is a classic example, but we're not there yet. Let's get to that in a minute. Let's talk about life with the phonograph and graphophone right now. So there are people who want music. There are people who are demanding that they be able to buy music recordings on this new device. And there are companies set up to sell those music recordings. Well, let's go back to PowerPoint because I've got some interesting photos that I want to show you here. This is what recording kind of looks like in that era. You have to, if you are the recording engineer, you have to set up, and let's really look at this bottom picture here. You see so many of the horns pointed toward the band here, because if you're trying to mass produce music using this tech, it's not easy. So what they end up doing is they'll hire a band, the band will come in, they'll set up, and then instead of having a recorder, they want to sell, let's say they want to sell 1,000 copies of this recording. That means they have to produce 1,000 cylinders. Well, to produce 1,000 cylinders, that means the band is going to have to play this. If you only have one machine, the band is going to have to play the song 1,000 times. And you know what? We treat our musicians poorly all through history, but that would be excessive. So the band doesn't play the song 1,000 times. What they do is, in these early days, they try and fit as many recorders into the room as they can. And it is the job of the recording engineer, as this person was at the time, to load blank cylinders onto all of these machines and then sort of run across the room, starting the record on all of these machines, strike up the band, let the band play. Let's say you could fit 15 recorders in the room. Well, now you've got 15 cylinders. You load another 15 blanks onto the machines, get the band to play it again until you end up with 1,000 cylinders. Think about how crazy this is. It means that in this era, if you and I both like a particular song, and so we both buy a recording of that song from the same company at the same time, it is possible that we will get two different performances of that song. Even if it's the same performance, we got it from two different machines, which means the way mine sounds is going to be different than the way yours sounds. The mix is going to be different, because the mix is entirely dependent on where the machine is placed in the room. If my machine was closer to the trumpets and your machine was closer to the tuba, you're going to have more bass in your mix. And it really wouldn't be bass. They did not capture those low frequencies on these devices, but you're going to have more tuba on your recording, and I'm going to have more trumpet. Which isn't great for quality control, is it? But it's the only way to do it. It's the only way to sell that number of cylinders. Maybe not the only way. So the next idea, when sales really took off, when this selling cylinders by mail thing really took off, they came up with another idea. The next idea was they would take these machines, and if you got, they would record in the same way actually, but in order to produce a greater number of cylinders, they figured you could set up two machines beside each other after the recording. After the band has gone home, they've played the song whatever number of times they're going to play the song. But then the next thing they're going to do is set up two machines at a single station. But instead of having the horn that is collecting the sound and cutting the groove, they're going to take the output of machine 1 and connect a rubber tube that connects to the input of machine 2. And remember, when I'm talking about input and output, there's no electricity here. There's no wires, there's no magnets, there's nothing magical happening. It's just changes in air pressure moving a diaphragm. So you've got this rubber tube that connects the back of one diaphragm to the front of another diaphragm. And when diaphragm A vibrates because its needle is riding in that groove from the recording, it sends that change in air pressure not through a resonant cone that is going to amplify it, but through this little piece of rubber tubing that is going to carry those air molecules compressing and rarefacting and moving in and out until it hits this other diaphragm and causes it to vibrate sympathetically, and that will scratch its own cylinder. Here's the thing. It's not a good process. If you got a second generation copy, it was mostly noise. But again, we didn't have audio recording prior to this. So the fact that you were buying an audio recording of a song that you liked at all, no matter what it sounded like, was a miracle. And so now you've got two different companies that are both successfully producing and creating these devices. And then you have people taking the devices and using them to record and sell music. And you've got Edison and Bell, and they're suing each other. It's a format war. It's no different than we have Spotify versus Apple Music now. And before that, we had iPod versus Zune. And before that, we had CD versus cassette. And before that, we had 8-track versus 33 RPM LP. And before that, we had 78s versus, oh my goodness, there's always been format wars. And this is sort of, as audio goes, this is the first one. This is your first format war. Phonograph versus Graphophone, Edison versus Bell. Okay. So, there are all of these problems with reproducing. And then there's this lawsuit, and part of the fallout of that lawsuit is, while it is in the appeals process, neither company can produce and sell more devices. They can sell off their back stock, they can't make new devices. So there's suddenly a demand in the market and no one to fill it. And this is the moment where we get our third great playback device. To fill in that hole in the market, Emile Berliner comes up with what he calls the gramophone. Now, this is based on an idea that he was using in toy manufacture all the way back in 1888. And the idea was that same groove that Edison was cutting in a cylinder, he was cutting in a flat disc. However, by 1894, he has perfected this into a really usable playback device for the consumer who wants music in their home. And he calls his device the gramophone. He takes it to market with a company of his own creation called the American Gramophone Company. That company later turns into Victor, and you will know Victor if you have ever seen this painting here, his master's voice. I've got a lot to say about that picture, but we'll save that for class time. In the meantime, to learn a little bit more about the gramophone, let's go check out me in the News Journal Center wearing a weird big winter coat. Me? While Thomas Edison and Alexander Graham Bell were busy suing each other over their near-identical devices, there was an opening in the market. In walked Emile Berliner with a device that was just different enough from the Edison and Bell devices that it didn't risk the same legal action and would become the most popular recording device of its era, the gramophone. Now, the gramophone, in many ways, functioned very similarly to the phonograph and graphophone. There was a vibrating membrane connected to a needle that was played in a groove. But, unlike the other two devices, the gramophone did not use cylinders. It used flat discs, like this one. One advantage of the flat disc is that it was able to be reproduced with greater ease. You could create a master plate and then press multiple copies off of that single master. This meant consistency in the product. If you and I bought the same recording, we were actually hearing the same performance coming off of the same machine. That was a big improvement over cylinders. So, Berliner not only invented the device, but also was the owner of the patent for the disc itself, which meant for a long time, if you wanted to produce these discs, and everyone did, you had to license the technology through Berliner. This is still the way most music services work. So you could say Emile Berliner was the first record label president, truly. This device, the gramophone, much like the phonograph, had a spring mechanism to regulate the speed of playback. Unlike the phonograph and graphophone, you weren't able to record on it at home on your own. So let's demonstrate how this works. There's a hand crank here, and I use that to increase tension on the spring. And then there is the tone arm, and connected to the tone arm, the needle. The original patent for this device said you would use a darning needle here. It's a much bigger needle than we think of being on phonographs today. Now, one more big difference between Berliner's gramophone and Edison and Bell's devices was that the gramophone had a vertical diaphragm. Here you see the needle. Here's the diaphragm. And so when that needle pushes the diaphragm back and forth, it creates a pressure difference in this tube, which is carried along through here until it finally gets to this resonant cone. There's nothing but air in all of this tubing. The sound wave is being amplified by the resonant properties of the cone here. Let's try it out. We'll release this latch, which will start the platter spinning. And then lower the needle. right. Let's just stop that right there. It still works. The groove held the vibration of a diaphragm connected to a needle as the sound wave first came into the machine. Once we pressed the copies of this album, that groove was intact. Now when the needle rides in the groove, it bounces up and down, pushing the diaphragm back and forth, and the diaphragm pushes the air molecules in front of it, creating those high-pressure zones, compression, and then those low-pressure rarefactions, right? The crest and the trough of the wave. And that wave, that tiny little difference in air pressure, bounces around this hollow metal tube, vibrating the tube along the way, amplifying the signal until it gets to this large resonant cone. And that's where the sound is coming from. There was no microphone. When you performed into this device, you were yelling into the cone. The band was playing, directing their energy into the cone. Mixing didn't exist. Mixing was this. You want more of one instrument? Push that instrument closer to the cone. You want less of another? Pull it back. If you were the singer, then part of your job was to stand out of the way during the intro to the song, and when it was time to sing, you would step in front of the cone, which did two things. It blocked the sound waves coming from the band, and it made your voice the closest, loudest part of the recording, which to this day is what we like. So as you heard, one of the great drawbacks of all of these devices was, even though they had improved the fidelity of the devices over the course of their existence between, 1877 and 1900 or so, they still didn't sound amazing, did they? That recording I just played you, yes, it was an old recording, but that's pretty similar to the quality that people were getting in their homes at the time. The reason was we were still recording completely without electricity, and that means without microphones. Because, as we're going to learn, the microphone converts a sound wave into electricity. Well, the trouble is it converts the sound wave into a very small amount of electricity, a teeny tiny bit of electricity. And we didn't have a way to amplify that teeny tiny bit of electricity to get a strong enough current to actually move a needle, to scratch a groove, to get a clear recording. So we were just using, it was more power just using the actual acoustic sound wave than we were able to generate with the output of a microphone. And it wasn't until the 1920s, the mid-1920s, before we got amplification figured out. But we'll talk about that in our next video, where we get into electric recording. Until then, it's been swell, but it's time to fade out. I'm Scott Velasco. We'll see you next time.
It was a Tuesday afternoon. It was a Tuesday afternoon. He put his hand on the doorknob. He began to turn.